Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by IB.com. We are dealing with the rise of Joseph Stalin in the USSR, which is under the paper 2 requirement for us as a part of the world study or world history topic number 10, which deals with authoritarian leaders in the 20th century. We've already dealt in great detail the way he rose after the death of Lenin. In fact, the Leninist past of the Soviet Union is something we've discussed. We've also discussed his fights with the left-wing opposition, and now we are dealing with the defeat of the right-wing opposition by him. So without any further ado, let's jump straight into his kind of agreements with the right-wing opposition once he had vanquished the left-wing opposition. Having defeated the left, Stalin now turned on the right-wing opposition, whose major representatives were Alexei Rykov, Mikhail Tomsky, and Nikolai Bukharin. Three men who had loyally served Stalin in his outflanking of Trotsky and the left. So these were the people who had in fact helped him a lot when he was trying to throw out Trotsky and Zinoviev and Kamenev, etc. Politically, the right were by no means as challenging to Stalin as the Trotskyite bloc had been. So the fact that most of us don't even remember these names when we think about the USSR clearly shows these were not men of any great challenge for somebody like Joseph Stalin. What made Stalin move against them was that they stood in the way of industrial and agricultural schemes that had in fact begun to take shape, and he had begun to implement them in 1928. His attack on the right was therefore an aspect of his own massive transformation of the Soviet economy. You see, one of the things that he was dreaming of, in fact, the fact that everybody remembered the October 1917 revolution in Bolshevism and in the Soviet Union as Lenin's revolution. So one of the dreams that Stalin has, in fact, at this point of time is to have a revolution in his name. So people to remember a revolution called Stalin's revolution. So and that had to be something that was really changing, or like really different from the very grassroots level. So in that context, he wanted to impose a very new kind of agricultural and economic change. And in that way, these were the leaders. The right was the leadership, which was now standing in his way for that kind of absolutely massive grassroots change. It is uncertain when Stalin finally decided that the answer to Soviet Union's growth problem was in fact collectivization and industrialization. We will be in fact breaking down these words in great detail in the coming sections, so we don't need to pause for them here. The likelihood that it was probably another piece of opportunism. Having defeated the left politically, he now felt free to adopt their economic policies. So these are actually leftist policies, collectivization and industrialization, but now he's adopting them only after he has completely vanquished them. The attitude of the right opposition then, how did these leaders, Tomsky and Rykov and Bukharin, behave to this? Let's see. Bukharin and the right argued that it would be less disruptive to let Soviet industry develop its own momentum. So they didn't want to, have anything mega changing. They just wanted the Soviet Union industry to grow at its own pace and its own momentum. The state should assist, they argued, but it should not be direct. Similarly, the peasants should not be oppressed, as this would make them resentful and less productive. The right agreed that it was from the land that the means of financing industrialization was coming till now, and they stressed that by offering the peasants the chance to become prosperous, far more grain would be produced for sale abroad. So theirs is a policy of persuasion rather than coercion, that tell the peasants that you are required for this, contribute to the national economy, let us sell your grains to the west and abroad, and that will help us grow into an industrialized nation. So that was their argument. The right's argument was this. Bukharin, in fact, declared in the Politburo, you would remember it's the top body with at least 15 to 20 members, and at the party congress in 1928, that Stalin's aggressive policy of state procurements was in fact counterproductive. So state procurement is basically the same thing when you give a number and there will be people who will go and requisite that number from the farmers, just like war communism. So enforced collection of grain from peasants is state procurement. He was prepared to state openly that what everybody knew but was afraid to admit, that Stalin's program was little different to the one that Trotsky had in fact previously advocated. So this is something that Bukharin, who is by the way an old friend of Stalin's, they had been exiled in Serbia together. So Bukharin thought that he was close enough to make these kinds of very open criticisms. He was clearly not seeing the change in the wind, and he was clearly not seeing that he was actually opposing the only remaining top leader of the Soviet bloc. So the whole idea of the collective leadership is long dead and gone. Stalin is emerging as the key leader. It's already 1928. Of course, they were suffering from certain weaknesses. The right suffered from a number of weaknesses which Stalin was ready to exploit. These related to their ideas, their organization, and of course the kind of limited support that they had. So in terms of ideas, a notable skill that Stalin had employed throughout his career after 1924 was the ability to play upon the fears of his colleagues and his compatriots. He consistently claimed that the USSR was always under threat from either internal enemies or external enemies. This seldom accorded with reality, but his constant exaggerations were believed by a party which became convinced that only through vigilance and ruthless treatment of enemies could the regime be safeguarded from the reactionaries who actually wished to overthrow it. So there's a number of people who are reactionaries who are going to respond to the regime and will try and tear it apart. And who is our only savior? Stalin. Who is the only person who can see all these enemies? Stalin. So he has the ability to constantly talk about, constantly manufacture enemies, both in his real life and outside, so that the people and the electorate and even those within the party lines, who by the way you would remember are the ones who owe their positions to him, who are very much under his patron-client relationship. These are the people whom he's constantly reminding that there are fears, there are things that you are supposed to be keeping in mind. Typical of Stalin's statements was his listing of the USSR's internal enemies to show the danger in which the revolution was. And you can see some of the enemies that he is naming here. He says the remnants of the dying classes, industrialists and their servants, private traders and their stooges, former nobles and priests, kulaks and their henchmen, they have all wormed their way into our factories, our institutions. What have they brought with them? Of course, they have brought with them their hatred of the Soviet regime, their feeling of hostility for the new forms of economy, way of life, and culture. So, enemies are everywhere. They are outside and inside. They are from the past. They are coming back, and they are going to completely tear us and destroy us. So, these are the kind of things that that he's actually absolutely convinced that he is going to tell the public, and most of it, believe it or not, he himself also believed. Stalin used the fears for the revolution, the 1917 revolution, the October revolution, which the people had made into a reality. He used the fears for the revolution felt by the party to undermine the right. Scorning Bukharin for underestimating the difficulties that the Soviet Union faced, he asserted that the dangerous times required not concessions to the peasants, but in fact a tough policy towards them. So he is going back to, in fact, what Trotsky was earlier saying: let's coerce the peasants. All right, let's make them give us the grains. Let's not requisite it from them, but rather get it by force from them. In taking this line, Stalin showed a shrewd understanding of the mentality of the party members. The majority were far more likely to respond to the call for a return to a rigorous policy on the land than they were to risk the revolution itself by untimely concessions to reactionary peasants. One of the things, of course, that we are ignoring here is the fact that why is it that the same party that was ready to hear, or in fact that is ready to hear Stalin at this point of time, 1928, why were they not ready to hear Trotsky 3 years ago when he was saying exactly the same thing? Well, the answer to that is that in those days, Stalin was using the same skill to show how what Trotsky is saying is in fact contrary to the revolution and contrary to Lenin's dream. So much of the benefit of the Soviet Union at that point of time, the same debate was couched in terms of saying that this is Lenin's dream, NEP, and this needs to be completed, etc., and so on and so forth. And now he's using the same ideas that Trotsky was giving just 3 years ago and trying to sell it and say that there's a brand new idea and it's my idea and let us try and implement it. What about the right's organization? The right experienced the same difficulty the left had. How could they impress their ideas upon a party while Stalin remained the master of the party? Bukharin and his colleagues wanted to remain faithful party members, and it was this sense of loyalty that in fact weakened them in their attempts to oppose Stalin. Please remember, these are all leaders who have contributed to the party since the October 1917 revolution. Alright, that's why it's quite difficult to believe that most of these people had to, in fact, under torture, confess that they were actually doing counter-party activities, whereas they were the ones who were the most loyal to the party and the party line. Fearful of recreating the factionalism that had been condemned by Lenin, they don't want to create, factions because they were like sworn Leninists. So they didn't want to create any factionalism. They hoped that they could win the party over by persuasion. The basic approach was always conciliatory. Let's make amends. Let's be polite. Let's make requests. That kind of attitude. All this, of course, played into Stalin's hands, who was far more ruthless and had very little understanding of what this loyalty to the party meant. Since it was largely his supporters who were responsible for drafting and distributing party information, it was not difficult for Stalin to belittle the right as being a weak and irresponsible clique, and again, blaming them for the same thing that they are not, which is a faction. So he's again and again through the party machinery spreading this around that Bukharin and his friends are trying to break the party. They're a faction in the party. We need to take care of them. And finally, of course, the lack of support that the right does not in fact enjoy within the party. The right's only substantial support came from the trade unions, whose central council was in fact chaired by Tomsky, and in the CPSU's Moscow branch, where Nikolai Uglanov, an admirer and supporter of Bukharin, was the party secretary. When Stalin realized that these might be a source of opposition, he acted quickly and decisively. He sent Lazar Kaganovich, a ruthlessly ambitious young Politburo member from Ukraine, to arrest the suspect trade unionists. and the right were overwhelmed by this political assault, Molotov was dispatched to Moscow, where he enlisted the support of pro-Stalin members to terrify the local party officials into line. So both of these bases, the remaining bases of the right's actual support, they were both taken off very quickly and decisively with the help of terror and torture methodology. And of course, this leads to the collapse of the right. By early 1929, the right were beyond recovery. Tomsky was no longer the National Trade Union leader. Rykov had been superseded as premier by Molotov, and Bukharin had lost his place in the Politburo. This trio of right opportunists, so they are being remembered as opportunists, they are being called opportunists, people who just wanted to misuse the party for their own purposes, were allowed to remain in the party, but only after publicly admitting the error of their ways. So again, even as late as 1928, Stalin doesn't have the right to, or doesn't have the power to execute them. That kind of power only he'll get in the 1930s. Stalin's triumph over both left and right was now complete. He was now in position to exercise power as the new Vozhd, or VOZHD. That's the name, that's the term, pardon me, in Russian for the leader. So just like Hitler is the Führer, Mussolini is Ildeus, Stalin takes the title of the Vozhd, so VOZHD, and having become in effect a communist czar. So there's a book also which is called The Red Tsar, and this is all about him becoming the new communist czar in Russia. The defeat of the right marks the end of any serious challenge to limit to his power from the late 1920s, somewhere around 28 and 29, to his death in 1953. So almost for a quarter of a century, Stalin would become increasingly dictatorial and increasingly authoritarian. With that, let's try and understand what and how he establishes this authoritarian state, which is at the heart of our topic. Stalin's imposition of a dictatorial control over the Soviet Union was achieved by the manner in which he developed his domestic policies. These are now examined in the following explorations. Number 1, economic policies, and number 2, purges. So let's look at his domestic policies, both under the economic heading and also under the more terrifying heading of the terror that he in fact imposed on the people, which are called the purges. So in terms of the economic policy first then, Stalin had decided by 1928, so by the time he has defeated the right and the left both, he decides that the USSR could not survive unless it rapidly modernized its economy. To this end, so with this purpose in mind, he set about completely reshaping Soviet agriculture and industry. So complete upheaval is necessary. The pretext that had been provided for this was in the 1926 by a critical resolution of the party congress, which is to transform our country from an agrarian into an industrial one, capable by its own efforts to producing the necessary means. So no longer are we interested in selling the agriculture produce to the West, taking the money from them and then developing. Instead, we want to develop into an agricultural industrial country in our own right. Stalin planned to turn the resolution into reality. There were 3 main aspects to this. Number 1, the economic aims. Number 2, the collectivization of the peasantry. And number 3, industrialization. So with the help of these 3 aims, he could then achieve the modernization that he dreamt of. More importantly, again I am repeating, the fact that all these 3 will contribute to what he thinks of as Stalin's revolution that shall be remembered in the Soviet past. What were some of these economic aims then? Stalin's economic policy had one essential aim, which is the modernization of the Soviet economy. This was to be achieved by 2 essential methods. Number 1, collectivization. Number 2, industrialization. So socially disruptive was this program, involving as it did the greatest land transfer in Russian history and the redirection of people's lives, that it could be achieved only by Stalin's government taking complete control of the lives of the Soviet people. So that is the requirement of authoritarianism here. Authoritarianism requires here for complete control of people's lives, because they are intending to completely disrupt their lives, completely reshape their lives, and completely tell them to what exactly is to be done in the name of modernity and in the name of industrialization and in the name of collectivization. So because these 3 are the key aims, lives of the people will be changed, and you can only change their lives through complete use of force and coercion, thus laying the seeds of the authoritarian government. And this will be called the revolution from above. So from 1928 onwards, the state took over the running of the nation's economy. So in everything, the state's intervention was complete. In theory, 1917 had been a revolution from below. So it was the people's revolution. The Bolshevik-led proletariat had begun the construction of a state in which the workers ruled. Theoretically, on paper, it was the rule of the workers. Bukharin and the right had used this notion to argue that since the USSR was now a proletarian society, the economy should be left to develop at its own pace without the interference of the government. That's the logic, that because now that people were in power for the last 10-11 years, let everything grow as per the people's choice, as per the workers' choice, and that this should be led without any interference from the government. Stalin's economic program ended such thinking. The state, in fact, would now come back fully and would now be completely in command of the economy from above. So, from above means total government control. Stalin called this momentous decision the second revolution. So, this is what I had been hinting at for so long. This is the second revolution which is being done by Comrade Stalin to indicate that this was in fact an important stage in Soviet history, just like the original 1917 revolution, which is Lenin's revolution. So now we are entering the phase of the second revolution. Again, these are all words that he's inventing and he's giving so that he can be remembered in a certain way by history textbooks. This comparison was obviously intended to enhance his own status as a revolutionary leader following in the footsteps of Comrade Lenin. Then, if these are the economic aims, modernization is the key part of them. Stalin believed that the survival of the Soviet Union depended on the nation's ability to turn itself into a modern industrial society within the shortest possible time. In fact, he expressed this with particular force in 1931, 3 years after getting complete power. What does he say? He says, it is sometimes asked whether or not it is possible to slow down the tempo somewhat or to put a check on the movement. He says, no, comrades, it is not possible. That means slowing down is not an option at all. The tempo must not be reduced. To slacken the tempo would mean flailing behind or falling behind. And those who fall behind get beaten. But we do not want to be beaten. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. So what we have lost in 50 to 100 years, we need to catch up in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed. So this all the time, the enemy is outside. He's trying to rush forward. He's going to rush very quickly. If you slow down, the enemy is going to defeat you. That kind of comparative logic. Either we do it or we shall be crushed. This is what our obligations to the workers and peasants of the USSR dictator. So it's not so much for us. It's not so much for the great Bolshevik party. It's for the peasants and the industrial workers. We owe it to them. Yes, if it comes at the cost of their lives, then there's no worry at all, because this kind of progress is obviously going to come at a cost. And who's going to pay the cost? The party is not going to pay the cost. The peasants and the workers are going to pay the cost. This passionate appeal to Russian history, the fact that we are the ones, we are at the right moment in history, we need to really catch up in 10 years what others have been doing in 50 to 100 years. This subordinated everything to the driving need for national survival. So it became a war in the name of the nation. And Stalin used this appeal as the pretext for the severity that accompanied both collectivization and industrialization. He justified the horrors of both collectivization and industrialization with this logic that we are catching up for the sake of the workers and peasants of our country. So we have been throwing around this word collectivization and industrialization a lot. Let's try and now unpack these terms and try and understand what is collectivization, what is industrialization that he is actually trying to do. There is something called collectivization which is adopted by Stalin for two reasons. Number one, to bring the peasants under control, and number two, to raise capital. Stalin worked to a simple formula to do this. Number one, he needed investments, industrial investment and manpower. Number two, the land could provide both, in the sense that land could also provide investment and could obviously give manpower to those people. Number three, surplus grain would be sold abroad to raise investment funds for the industry, like that has always been done, especially under NEP. And surplus peasants would then become factory workers. So if you introduce mechanization of the farmland, the farmer would then leave his land and come to the industry. So that's the logic that you are using. Mechanize and really reduce the work on the farmland, make it more efficient and productive, and thereby increase more the number of workers in the industries. That's the logic that he is using. As a revolutionary, Stalin had little sympathy for peasants. Communist theory, and Marxist theory even now, taught that the days of the peasantry as a revolutionary social force had in fact passed. October 1917 had been the first stage in the triumph of industrial proletariat, the industrial working class. Obviously, the question here is that if the industrial working class exists, why do you need to do all this? Why are you still trying to industrialize if there's an industrial working class? That means there's some gap in that logic. Therefore, it was perfectly fitting that the peasantry should now bow to the demands of industrialization. In fact, Marx, in his very famous statement, said that the peasant has false consciousness, that the true consciousness of the revolution only belongs to the working class and the proletariat, and therefore the fact that peasants' needs are being subordinated completely is in fact very much in line with Marxist theory. Stalin defined collectivization as the setting up of collective farms in order to squeeze out all the capitalist elements from the land. So if all the farmers come together, all the capitalists shall be squeezed out, and that's what we want. The state would now own the land, so all the land goes back to the state. Everything that Lenin had done immediately after coming to power in the Bolshevik Revolution, which is give the land to the peasants, everything is taken back by Stalin. The peasants would no longer farm the land for their own individual profit, so anything that they were gaining out of it as a part of NEP, all that is shut down. The plan was to group between 50 to 100 peasant holdings into one unit. So because there are such tiny units, you can easily group 50 to 100 peasants units into one huge unit. That's why the term collectivization, because you collect all these 50 to 100 units into one unit. It was believed that large farms would be more efficient and in fact would encourage the effective use of agricultural machinery. And that is what something I've just told you, which is that this mechanization is going to lead people into leaving the farms because the machine can do their work, and then of course joining the workforce in the industries. Now, of course, there is one class of rich peasants which existed, in fact, which pre-existed and which in terms of existence, which go beyond and before the birth of the Communist Party, which is the kulaks, which are the rich peasant in this case. So, what about the kulaks? When introducing collectivization in 1928, Stalin claimed that it was voluntary. So, that's the joke that he, of course, I'm calling it a joke, but it was, of course, a much more serious thing here, which is that it was voluntary, that you will never be forced into doing this. But in truth, it was in fact forced on a very reluctant peasantry. In a major propaganda offensive, Stalin identified a class of kulaks, rich peasants who were in fact holding back the workers' revolution by hoarding their produce and keeping food prices high, thus making themselves wealthy at the expense of the workers and poorer peasants. They had to be broken, he says, as a class. And that is why the entire process of dekulakization that became a state enforced campaign. So the rich peasants have to be gotten rid of. Now you obviously understand it's a trick. It's a trick to completely classify anybody who opposes you and is rebelling against the coming together of the collectivization. So even if it is a middling level or poor level person or peasant who is opposing your collectivization effort, you simply brand that person as a kulak. You simply claim that he's the enemy of the people who is doing it for his own sake. That person might be doing it for other reasons. That person might be doing it for the sake of their own property or for the sake of personal property or for the sake of, saving that land that they had thought was traditionally and familiarly theirs. But no, you're not going to justify and you're not going to recognize officially any of these reasons. The only reason you're going to justify and recognize officially is the single pointed agenda that you are the enemy of the people, you will be taken care of. So any nuance, in other words, is completely destroyed. Every enemy of the collectivization campaign became automatically kind of a threat and had to be gotten rid of in the name of dekulakization. Pardon me, it's a tough word to pronounce in that sense. All right. The concept of a kulak class was a Stalinist myth. That's what I was saying, that it's a Stalinist myth. It's created. The so-called kulaks were really only those hardworking peasants who had proved more efficient farmers than their neighbors. In no sense did they constitute the class of exploiting landowners described in Stalinist propaganda. Nonetheless, given the tradition of landlord oppression going back to Tsarist time, the notion of a kulak class proved a very useful one and provided the grounds for the coercion of peasantry as a whole. So this is something that is used to bring the peasantry as a whole in line. Middle and poor peasants as well as kulaks. So how does this dekulakization work? In some regions, the poorer peasants undertook dekulakization with enthusiasm. So some of the poorer peasants are very happy that, oh, let's go and get these kulaks rid of all their wealth that they have collected at the expense of the Soviet state. And since it provided them with an excuse to settle old scores and to give vent to local jealousies. Land and property was seized from the minority of better off peasants, and they and their families were in fact physically attacked. Such treatment was often the prelude to arrest and deportation by OGPU, anti-kulak squads. What is OGPU? OGPU is now the new Cheka. The secret police is now called OGPU. Later on, it will become the NKVD, and finally, it will get its final avatar in which it exists even today, which is the KGB. So, Cheka, OGPU, NKVD, and now the KGB. So now the OGPU is of course also very closely involved. The secret police is very closely involved in this entire function, and they are also helping the poorer peasants to get rid of the kulaks. The renewal of terror also served as a warning to the mass of the peasantry of the likely consequences of resisting the state reorganization of Soviet agriculture. Please remember, in 1928 it was told you can do this voluntarily. But now very clearly, with this entire growth of the complete destruction of this in the name of this class called the kulaks, others also who are thinking of rebelling, it's a very clear message to them: you shall be terrorized and brought into line. So you better pay attention. The destruction of the kulaks was thus an integral part of the whole collectivization process. As the Soviet official later admitted, most party officers thought that the whole point of dekulakization was its value as an administrative measure, which is the speeding of the tempos of collectivization. So, a lot of people, in fact, thought that dekulakization and collectivization are very closely linked and are, in fact, speaking to each other. Now, of course, this will not be very easy. You remember the peasants who under war communism were not ready to give up anything, and that's why Lenin had to bring in NEP. So clearly, what about those peasants who are now opposing it? Obviously, the state is much more powerful than it was ever was under Lenin. So this opposition will be crushed. But nevertheless, it's useful to record that there was, in fact, opposition to this entire scheme, bizarre scheme of collectivization. So what was the resistance then to collectivization? In the period between December 1929 and March 1930, so a period of 4 months, nearly a quarter of the peasant farms in the USSR were collectivized, yet peasants in their millions resisted. Okay, so there's a huge story of resistance as well. What amounted to a civil war, in fact, broke on the countryside. So it's not an easy thing, okay? Please understand that it's not as if the peasants very quietly and humbly submitted to the Soviet states. No, their backs were broken and they were made to submit. And the following details indicate the scale of disturbance, complete disturbance that is in fact recorded in official figures. Mind you, these are official figures. Okay, these are the figures in the archives. The reality must have been way worse, given that it's kind of, such a very clear kind of destructive and disruptive movement. So clearly the reality must have been way worse. Between 1929 and 30, there were 30,000 arson attacks, so burning, etc. took place, and the number of organized rural mass disturbances increased from 172 in the first half of 1929. So in the second half, that means within 6 months, that number grew up to 229. However, peasant resistance, no matter how valiant and desperate, stood no chance of stopping collectivization. By the end of 1930s, virtually the whole of the peasantry had been collectivized. So year-wise, if you look at the decade of the 1930s, everything had fallen into place. The terrors, the tortures, the marches, the madness, everything works, and Stalinist state has clearly been able to establish its complete supreme authority and power. One could think of it in those terms also, that that this was actually the final aim in some senses, could have been the final aim in some senses of the question of war communism, which Lenin could not impose, and that's why it's being called the second revolution by Joseph Stalin. We have the growth of, in fact, we have the fall of annual food consumption, and we also have the number of livestock in millions falling between these 3-4 years also, and this is a result of the consequence. I mean, it's a direct result of collectivization only. So let's look at the consequences of collectivization then. Collectivization, of course, created a massive social upheaval. Bewildered, shocked and confused, the peasants became disoriented by the deliberate destruction of their traditional ways of life. It was a clearly torturous method that really wanted to destroy their way of life that they had been following for thousands of years, for hundreds of years, pardon me. The consequences were, of course, increasingly tragic. The majority of the peasants chose to eat their seed corn and slaughter their livestock. There were no crops left to reap or animals to rear. Starvation, which in many parts of the Soviet Union persisted throughout the 1930s, was in fact worst in the years of 32 and 33 when a national famine occurred. Estimates suggest that almost 6 to 8 million people died, with the population of Ukraine and Kazakhstan suffering particularly severely. And Ukraine especially is a very important case study because it's supposed to be the bowl of Russia, that it's supposed to be providing. Its soil was so good that it was supposed to be providing a lot of stock and a lot of grains, but it in itself goes through a very major crisis and famine crisis at this point of time. Desperate peasants moved to the towns in huge numbers. So great was the migration that a system of internal passports had to be introduced in an effort to control the flow, because that is what Stalin had wanted. He had thought that these people will leave the farms and they will enter the cities and work in the industries. But when that really happens in such huge numbers, nobody is prepared to in fact put that infrastructure in place. Please do remember, industries don't exist. They are doing this to the farm so that the money can be raised and then industries will be built. So when these farmers are coming to the cities looking for jobs, they realize that it doesn't exist. So the whole revolution happened in the name of the proletariat, but there was no proletariat which could, be added to in this case. Despite overwhelming evidence of the tragedy that had overtaken the USSR, there were only 2 oblique references to this in the state press, as well as serving to project the image of Stalin as the great planner. This conspiracy of silence, that's a very beautiful phrase, this conspiracy of silence effectively prevented the introduction of measures to ease the distress. Now, how can you ease the distress if you don't even acknowledge that there is distress? So the fact that the distress wasn't even acknowledged, the pain wasn't even acknowledged, clearly meant that there would be no measures to ease it in any way. And finally, leaving aside questions of human suffering, the enforced migration under Stalin had one positive economic result, which is it relieved the pressure on the land and provided the workforce that will very soon enable the industrial program that he had to start. So that was something that was his plan. And that is something that really happens because, as you have just seen, in like thousands and in almost in millions, these people are now moving across the country. Internal passports are being introduced. So that working class that he was thinking of introducing in industrialization as a way of that modernization exercise, that at least is ready in this case. So how does that industrialization happen? How does this working class really help him? All of that will be a part of our next exploration. I really hope to see you in that next video and continue the story of Stalin's economic aims and the way he brings into force the second revolution. Till then, thank you so much.